Welcome to a special edition of the TimCo Retail Manager course. We built the TimCo Retail Manager application to simulate what a real-world application would look like so we can use it as a learning testbed. One of the big areas of focus was on upgrading to .NET Core, and now we're at that point. In fact, we've already upgraded two of our projects to .NET Standard 2.0, both of our class libraries. In this video, we're going to upgrade our API project to .NET Core 3.0. That's going to be a little bit different of a conversion process than we've seen so far. We'll see how to perform the update in just a minute. But first, for those of you who are Patreon members at the $5 per month level or higher, don't forget to head over to Patreon to get today's source code. That will also give you a chance to check out the special bonus offer for Patreon members during this upgrade process. Now, for mailing list members, you should have gotten a special offer already this week. If you aren't a mailing list member, sign up using the link in the description. Another special offer will be going out later this week. Finally, I'm launching this series as a course on IamTimCorey.com. You can purchase the entire course, including all the videos in this series, as well as source code from every video, fully downloadable content, and more. The course will cover everything through the upgrade to .NET Core. If you've been a Patreon member paying for the source code each week, you're going to be getting a great deal on the course. And if not, you'll have to pay a bit more, which is only fair, but you'll get everything all at once. Check out the link in the description for more details. Okay, let's go over to the source code. And we're going to cover today the API. So the API is this project right here, the TRM Data Manager. And we're going to upgrade this to .NET Core. Now before what we did was we would unload this project and modify the CS proj file. The thing is, with web projects, there's been a lot of changes. It's not just, okay, change the CS proj file, it's also change how app start works and change how the dependency injection works, because now there's dependency injection built right in. And move over to app config or app settings.json from web config. And all these different changes. And so it's not just a simple, let's move it over. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new project and then move our content over into that project and then delete the old project. Now, we could remove this project from our solution. We could move it somewhere else on disk. We could open up the CS proj file in a different solution explorer and then create the same named project. I'm not going to go that far. Instead, what I'm going to do is create a new project with a new name. And that's okay. It's up to you if you want to do a new name or the same project and just move this project out first. I prefer a new name because of the fact that it signifies this is different. And that way, we have a very clear distinction. This is the old version, this is the new version. So let's do that. And instead of TRM Data Manager, I'm going to call this the TRM API. That probably sounds about right. Now, it's going to mean that TRM Data Manager.library doesn't as closely associate with TRM API. So the folder is going to have to do that for me. I could rename TRM Data Manager to something else, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. So I'm going to say add new project. I'm going to choose ASP.NET Core Web Application and hit next. I call this I did capital TRM everywhere else. I'm going to do the same thing. And then API, A capital I, but PI is lowercase. I prefer that naming convention. I'm not a big fan anymore of the TRM at the beginning. That did tag it for us, but I think I want to name it something different. Naming is tough. Okay? And I could do API to be in compliance with anything else, but that just seems wrong too. So we're just going to go TRM API like so. And we'll hit create. And now it's going to ask us what type of application you want. I'm going to choose an API. My choices here are .NET Core 2.1, 2.2, and 3.1. And the reason why is because I've got the latest bits installed on here. And 3.1 and still in preview phase, but it is out for preview. It shouldn't cause us any problems, so I'm going to leave it at 3.1, and I could back it down if I want to. Now over here on the right, we have configure for HTTPS. That's something we didn't have in our original TRM Data Manager, so that's a nice addition. We do want to add our individual user accounts. And this is what we want. Like we've got, it says connect to an existing user store in the cloud, Azure AD B2C application. That's not what we have. Now, it used to be to have this drop-down option here where you can say, I just want it to be local on my machine, which is what we used in our .NET Framework version. So how do we get around this? Well, this is not a Core 3.1 issue. This is actually an issue with API. API is just an API. When we installed API 4 for .NET Framework, we got controllers that were not just API controllers, but also web controllers, where we had the ability to have a login page and all the rest. Well, that's not in API anymore. API is just the API. It can also add in other things, but by default, out of the box, it's just API. So how do we get the rest? Well, we could actually go to Web Application and then also use API. Let's actually go to Web Application Model View Controller to be as close as possible to what we were doing before. So it's going to have the MVC code, but also have API in it as well. We'll change the authentication here to individual user accounts and store user accounts in app. That's the option we didn't have with the Web API. And the reason why is because you have no way of then creating those accounts with Web API because there's no user interface. Now, we can set it up where we can go through, say, Swagger and set them up, but that's not something they're expecting you to do. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create this as a MVC project, and then later we'll decide, do you want to keep the MVC project or do you want to have just the API? And if you want just the API, then we'll take out the MVC stuff. Because while it used to be that these projects were different, anymore all three project types, the Razor pages, the MVC project, and the API project, they're the same project with just things turned on or turned off. So you can turn them on or turn them off later as you want to. This will get us the closest possible to what we had with our original API. So we're going to do this. So now I have individual user accounts. We have configure for HTTPS is checked. It has to be when you have authentication. We're not going to enable Docker. I am doing .NET Core over here and ASP.NET Core 3.1. You can do 3.0, it's just fine. Hit create. Now create for us our project. And if we set this as a startup project, we can then play around with that in just a minute. Okay, so now we have our project, our new project, that is a .NET Core 3.1 project. Okay, you can even back up to 3.0 there if you wanted to. In fact, let's do that. Hit save, and now it's a 3.0 project instead. That way it's the same version as what you probably have. So now we have this project. Let's go ahead and launch it. I'm going to launch it using the Kestrel launcher. It doesn't really matter. It says it build errors. Okay, what's the build error? I'm using a 3.1 version of Entity Framework. Let's go ahead and go back to it. I could back everything off, but let's just stick with 3.1 for now, and that'll be fine. So now we're launching this again. And we're launching this is Kestrel, so we're going to launch this window here, which is the console type window that actually launches our application. And there we go. We now have our MVC site, which also can do API calls. It does not have anything hooked up yet for an API, I don't believe. But we can play around with it from here. Now, one thing we need to look at is appsettings.json, which this replaces web.config. And in here we have our connection string, including our default connection, which is to this database right here, which is ugly. And that's our entity framework created database for logins. Now we could use our existing login system, but I think what we're going to do is create a new login database. So I have to recreate our users. But that will ensure we can keep our old database running with our new database and not have to worry about creating changes in our database because of the new system that then means we can't use our old system anymore. So I'm going to create a separate database. We'll recreate my login. So I'm going to change this database name though, because this is not great. Let's call this API auth DB. All right, so that's going to create the API auth DB. We'll save that. And let's go poking around just a little bit. Let's start with our data. We have our migrations. We have our application DB context. Not a lot in application DB context. Our migrations are created for us. So here's our migrations, and that's where it's going to create the different tables, which look exactly the same as they used to. I don't think there's any changes to this. So I think we could get away with using the same database, but I'm not going to risk it right now. If you decide later on, you know what, we're going to try and do this, make a copy of your database or back it up first, and then give it a shot, and you can migrate your users over to the new system by just pointing to the old database and making sure that it applies any changes it needs to. Okay, so it should work. It's just that once you do that, you really don't want to go back to the old system. You don't want to use the same database for the old authentication and the new authentication at the same time. So let's go poke around again, go to areas, identity, pages, and there's view start, which has just about nothing in it. So you may be asking the question, where is all this identity stuff? Where's the login information? Where's the configuration for the different views? Well, it's all in a DLL essentially. We do have the login partial, this partial right here, but beyond that, if we want to make changes, what we need to do is actually go in here and add in basically overrides for the different pages. We're not going to do that. We're going to leave the pages alone and say, you know what, the default pages are fine. So let's launch this again, and this time I'm going to create an account. So once this launches, I'll bring it over here. We're going to register an account. I'll register my Tim at IamTimCorey.com, my super complicated password. It's PWD12345 period, the capital P. And it says, hey, do you want to apply migrations? Why, yes, I do. Try refreshing this page. It's now confirmed my registration. Okay, I don't have a real email sender registered, so you can go to these docs to figure out how to configure a real email sender. Otherwise, just click here to confirm your account. You wouldn't normally do this. Normally, you would look at these docs, figure out how to wire up an email sender, and have it email the user a confirmation link that they then click on. But for our demo purposes, yep, click there to confirm, and now I can log in with my, again, nope, this is Tim at IamTimCorey.com, PWD 1 through 5 and a dot, and let's remember me, log in. There you go. Hi, Tim at IamTimCorey.com. It knows who I am, and we're all good to go. Okay, so now we have our new database. We go to SQL Server Object Explorer and refresh our databases. We should see an API auth DB. We do. And in here under users, we're going to see that we have one user. That's Tim at IamTimCorey.com. I do believe that normalize might be a new field. So maybe a few extra fields. So now we have our application set up. We have our API, or actually our web application up and running. What do we do now? Well, we need to start bringing over our controllers. That's the place to start. We don't need our account controller, I don't believe. That was generated for us. And that's something that we don't have anything in here that we modified, or at least not that we're going to keep. So we'll leave that one alone. Our home controller, that was for the home page. We don't need to have that. But the next one is our inventory controller. We need this one. So let's bring this one over. I'm going to copy everything here for the entire class, including the authorize. Let's right-click on controllers and say add controller. And I want an API controller that's empty. I'm going to hit add. I'm going to call this inventory controller. This is going to scaffold out my API. It's going to be empty, but it's going to scaffold out for us. And essentially, we're going to use the same inheritance structure and then just paste in our content. Okay, so once this gets done, it takes a little bit the first time. Notice, you probably missed it, it was downloading and restoring NuGet packages. So let's actually copy everything inside the controller, not the class itself. And we'll paste this in. Okay, we'll also add the authorize attribute. We'll do control dot to add the using statement for Microsoft.ASP.core.authorization. There we go. And now we're getting closer, but we have a couple of things we have to change. We're missing the inventory model, and we're missing the inventory data. Those are the two things we're looking for here. So let's go down into our API and bring them over. Now you can go and say, you know what, let's make this work and then do the next one. I find it's a little confusing because you're bouncing around between models and DLLs and all the rest. Instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is save this as it is. I'm going to close it out, close out my inventory controller, and go to my next controller. I'm going to finish my controllers, then move on to models. Then I'm going to go on to references, and then from there, we'll see if we have anything left. So models, then controllers, and then anything left. Okay, product controller. So I'm going to grab this, just the method calls inside here. I'm going to add a new API controller, empty, and this is going to be the product. Make sure you spell these things the same way. And don't forget we're missing the authorize attribute, so we have to bring that back in. So bring this back over here. Yes, we're missing the model and the product data, but that's okay. Now let's go to sale controller. It's singular. It has an authorize attribute. So we'll right click on controllers and say add controller API. Call it sale controller. Now I could have copied and pasted these entire files over, but I didn't. And here's why. Let's add the authorize and the control dot. The reason why I didn't do that is because this is a little different than our normal structure. This says the route is API/controller name, which is API/sale. That matches up with what we have here, but we didn't specify it. We just specified in the route. Also, we have this as an API controller. Notice it inherits from controller base, not from our API controller. That's because controller base works across all of them, and we're saying this is actually an API controller. So if we went to home controller, there's controller because that's an MVC controller, but controller base allows us to say it's actually an API controller. So there's a little bit of subtle differences in our files. Also notice the namespace is different. So I'm going to make sure those namespaces are correct by creating my classes in the right location instead of moving these files up. If you want to move the files up and just make the modifications you need to the decorators, you could do that as well. Okay, user controller. So let's grab all of this down through this curly brace. Make sure you grab the right curly brace ending, otherwise you'll mess things up. So there's 2 that I'm not grabbing. So this is the user controller, and it's an authorize on the controller itself. So controller, API controller, user, it's singular. Once we scaffold this out, we will paste this in and also add the authorize. Control dot to add the using statement there. Now the product, let's go back real quick to the product controller. So I didn't add the using statement here. I was trying to remember if I add that using statement. I didn't think I did. And that's why. So now we have all of our controllers for our API in place. So a quick comparison, we have the home controller, which is actually an API, or the MVC controller. But our APIs are inventory, product, sale, and user. Inventory, product, sale, and user. Those are the ones we have down below. So we have now moved over all of our controllers. Let's go to models. So in models, we have a number of models. This first one here is a count binding model. That's from our authentication system. We're going to not bring that one over. Let's close out all these documents. Let's go to a count view model instead. That's also from our authorization, so we don't want to bring that one over. Application user model, this is ours. So let's copy all of the values inside of the class, and we're going to right click on models and say add class application user model. Make it public, which it already is. That's awesome. And we'll paste in our 3 values. Next, we're going to go to identity model. This is also something from our identity system or authorization system, so we don't need that. User role pair model. This is ours. So I'll grab this, right click and say add, and say user role pair model. Make sure you get it right. Paste it in, and we've now moved our models over. So you have our models moved over and our controllers moved over. And now I think that the only thing we have left is, well, we have a lot of dependencies here. But we have a reference to our library. So let's add a reference to our TRM data manager.library. And now let's do a rebuild on our API. And it says, hey, we're missing some things. Inventory model. Okay, control dot to add the using statement. Inventory data. Control dot to add the using statement. That solves that problem. Product controller. Control dot to add the using statement. Product data. Control dot. Sale model. Control dot to add the using statement. And the user control dot to add that using statement as well. Requested context dot principal dot identity dot get user. That may be an issue, but we'll see. I don't want to add a reference to system.web if I can help it. I'm not sure that's what I want for this. I might want to do this differently. Control dot on user data to add the using statement. On our model, same thing. Application DB context, add a using statement. Our application user, add a using statement. And application user, add a using statement. And it's still looking for something here for application user that's not quite right. So we're going to figure out how to change this because it looks like it's changed in EF core, Entity Framework core, how we get this information. So DB context, we don't have a using statement for that. Application user, we'll wait on that. Add to role. Let's just see if we have a using statement here or something to do. Add to role becomes add to role async. So that's going to be a change there. Remove from role is probably the same thing. Become async. So we will work on that. Is there anything else in the API to work on? Let's do a rebuild. And it looks like I have 21 errors. Let's start double clicking on them. Sale data. Did I miss this somehow? I must have missed the sale data. Request context, get user ID. I'm still having an issue here on how to get user ID. Let's go back to our error list and let's look through. Is there anything else in here that doesn't look like one of those application users issues? And I don't think there is. I think we're all good there. So let's start our modification process. So in .NET Core, I did some quick research, and yes, we have changed how we get the user ID. So let's comment this code out because that's not going to work. Instead, let's say user dot, we're going to find first. The documentation says find first value, but I think that's changed. Oh, nope, using system.security.claims. So find first value, and then in here, we want to say claim type. It's actually capital C here. Claim type dot types. Dot name identifier. So give me the identifier of the user, the ID. All right. So this is going to return back a string that is the user ID. So whenever we see this request context.principal.identity.getUserID, we're going to replace that with this right here. So let's see if we can find the other places where we ask for the user ID. I believe it was in, I could just do a search probably, couldn't I? But I believe it's over here somewhere. Right there. There we go. And control dot to add the using system.security.claims. And now we can get the user ID that way. All right, so that solves a couple of problems. And I'll leave that there for you. We'll just say the old way is this. Now, if you know how to use get, you can just use the get to go back to this version and do a comparison. You can see the old way versus the new way, but this way is just easy as well. Okay, so now we can do a build again or rebuild. We'll still have errors. We should have less. All right, we have 15 errors. Now, I think what we need to do here is we're newing something up. And WebAPI, we don't use the new up option anymore. We shouldn't. We can use our dependency injection system. So let's create a constructor in our controller. And we're going to ask for the application DB context. And we'll call it context. And then we'll do a control dot to create our private field. And then down here, we can get rid of this using statement. And we can get rid of the ending curly brace. And we can format our document a little bit. And we'll say this is underscore context. So that solves one of our problems, I think. But I think that instead of, there we go, context.roles.toList seems to work. Now that's an identity roles list. But what if we did, let's look for underscore context dot users to list. That seems to work as well. So let's find out what we're doing here. Let's see if this is what we were looking for. So we have our user.id, it's still there. ID, we have email address is still there, but we don't have roles. So there's not a roles list here. So I think this is going to take some reworking. It's not going to be just a simple, hey, let's replace it with a new name. And that's going to happen sometimes with your upgrades. So first of all, I don't think we need the user manager or user store anymore. Also notice we were newing those up. You want to avoid that if possible. This newing up here is fine. We were actually creating a new list, and that's a list of model. That's not something where we would get that from dependency injection. But otherwise, we want to get our instances from dependency injection. So we don't need those. We've got the users and the roles, but that's not quite what we're looking for, because the user list, these user items which are identity user, that does not contain a list of roles, as we've seen. So let's rethink how we're going to do this. Let's first of all take away this list of roles. I don't think we're going to need it that way. And let's comment out this right here. We're going to have it here, but we're not going to do it the same way. So now we have, this would work, but we have no roles associated with our user. So let's create a link query that's going to give us our user roles. Let's say var user roles equals, and we're going to create a full-on link query. So from, and let's pull from, let's start with you are in underscore context dot user roles. So this user roles list is going to give me a list of just the user ID and the role ID, and that's it. But now let's join this. We're going to say join on R in context.roles. That gives us a list of all the roles in the system. We're going to say on ur.roleID equals r.id. So it's going to link the role ID to the ID in the role table, or roles table. So now let's do a select statement. Select new anonymous object. We're going to say ur.userID, and then ur.roleID, and then r.name. So now we have all three pieces that we need. We have the user ID, which is associated with a particular role. We have that same role ID that's associated with, as well as the role name. Okay, so now with this information, we can do a little bit better than we have in the past with this for each. Instead, what we can do is we can come down here and say we were assigning to roles. So user.roles. So user.roles. Oops, I'm sorry, u.roles. And let's actually overwrite the entire thing. Because right now it's a dictionary of type string. So let's add our own dictionary in and say user roles dot where, and we're going to look up and say only the ones that match our ID. So where x.userID equals double equals u.id. It's going to match that user ID up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to convert this to dictionary. And the dictionary is of type string. So we're going to start off with our key and then our value. Now you could name this X or you could name it key. I'm going to do key, but I'm not really thrilled with doing this. I'll probably go back to using X later, but I want to show you this. So I can say key equals, or arrow function, key dot, and then the key is the role ID. So it's actually the key is the whole object. It's not saying this is the key, but it's going to go, that's going to be a key value. So you got key and a value pair. So val arrow function val dot name. Okay? So what this is going to do is it's going to create for me a dictionary of all of the key value pairs or all the role IDs and role names that this user, because it's just this user, is associated with. We're going to put that into roles. So this right here will replace this code right here. And I believe that will solve that problem. Now let's come down here and look at what we have down here. We have another using statement. So first of all, this one's done, but we can come down here and see we need context in order to do this. Well, that's not a problem because we can just get rid of our using statement and say underscore context, and we're all set. The same thing here, we can get rid of our using statement and say, actually get rid of all of this. I don't think we need any of this. But we do have to figure out the add to role. Now I think we do need to have user manager here. So let's come up here to the top and let's see if we can ask for user manager. And let's say user manager is a name. And actually it's going to yell at you first because it's saying, hey, I don't know who that is. Let's do ASP.NET user manager. And it's saying still no. Actually, I think it is user manager. Let's go back to that for a minute. And I think it's identity user. Like so. I think that's it. So let's add our private field for user manager. Let's come down here and say, what happened to do underscore user manager? Let's do our shift tab here. It says add to role isn't going to work, but we have add to role async. Okay. And then it says no. So it says here that it's looking for identity user. So if we did, I believe it's context dot users dot, let's see if we can find a lookup here. I don't see one, but we might have one actually in user manager. I'm going here without Googling this. I'm just going to see what we can find. Users, there's an iQueryable list of users if the store is an iQueryable user store. We can also look for a find by ID async, finds and returns a user, if any, who has a specified user ID. That sounds about right. We have a user ID, so find user ID. So the user ID is pairing.user ID, and that should return for us a var user. So that's going to be identity user. We got to await that, which means we need to make this an async task in order to use this. That's not a big deal because APIs inherently are asynchronous even if they are not marked asynchronous. That's not a big deal. So now I can say, instead of pairing.user ID, we can pass in user, and then we can say await on this. So we can await the add user to role asynchronous. Okay? And now we'll do the same thing down here for remove. So let's do something similar where we're going to come down here and basically replicate this code. So we'll actually copy and paste. But make sure we get it right this time. Copy and pasting is really dangerous. We want to remove from role. So remove from role async. And it should be the same thing here, but we got to mark this as async task. and now it's not going to yell at us anymore. We can get rid of this code. Okay, so now our code is a little more brief, it's a little smaller, and we're making use of our dependency injection system to get us what we need without instantiating it. So it looks like that's going to do it for us. I think that that's all the code that needs to change there. Now let's go to our error list, and we have 2 warnings here about template generation, but I think that just has to do with using the 3.1. So let's rebuild this. It's going to restore, and it's building. Once this little progress bar down here is done, rebuild all succeeded. So it seems as though it has worked. Let's start just the API itself and see if it starts up. Again, design time errors versus runtime errors, it's important to differentiate the two. So it looks like it's working. I'm logged in as Tim. Everything appears correct. Notice I'm at localhost port 5001 right now. So the question is, can I just start using this with my WPF project? Well, a WPF project in the app.config, it says that the value for the API is something totally different. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to open up Notepad, and I'm going to just paste it in there. I'm going to change all of this. Okay, notice it's HTTP, not HTTPS. That's not great. But now we're going to change that to HTTPS, and it's port 5001. With that, in theory, this is going to work the way it used to. Let's find out if it actually does. Oh, before we do need to add in our roles. So one of the things we need to do is we need to go down to, I believe, Startup. And what we're looking for is where we reference the, right here, add default identity. We have to add one more thing in here where we say add, and it's, I believe, roles. Add roles, and then we're going to say identity role. And what this will do is it'll add roles into our authentication, because by default, they're not in there anymore. That's one of those things where Microsoft said, you know what? You're not always using roles, so why do we have them in all the time? So now they're out. Okay? So I think that's one of the changes we need to make. But we also have to actually add our roles, because we have none right now, and we need to add and say this user has access to these, or is a part of these roles. Now let's first check to make sure that we don't have any roles in these tables. I'm sure we don't, but let's just check. There's no roles. Okay. So what we're going to do is we could put this code anywhere, and this is the code I avoided putting somewhere before, but I'm going to put it here now just temporarily to create our roles. Now, if you wanted to, you could save this code and put it somewhere and have it run every time, or you can have it trigger somehow. I'm going to put it in the privacy page. Is this a great place for it? No, not really. But at the same time, it's going to kind of demonstrate how you could set this up to be triggered once in a while. So I'm going to ask for the roles, the role manager, which it's up here, the user manager, and I'm going to do role manager as well. I should just do role manager first. Let's see if we need the user manager. So we probably do. Role manager control dot to add the using statement there, and it's identity role, and we're going to say role manager and add our private field for that. And now here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, let's do a string array and say roles equals, and then have my array of, it's admin, and there, what's the next role we need? Let's check our roles here. Manager is another one, and then cashier. Okay, so manager and cashier. All right. And so for each of these roles, what I'm going to do is I am going to do a for each on this list. So for each role in roles, I'm going to loop through this string array. And we're going to say var does role exist? Okay, equals await, which means we have to make this an async task of type action result. But again, all of our controllers are asynchronous even if we don't mark them that way. So it's no big deal. So async, and we're going to say role manager dot role exists async and pass in the role name, which is role. And then we're going to say if role exists equals false. So it does not exist. Then what we're going to do is we're going to await role manager dot create async new identity role, and we're going to pass in the role name, which is role. Okay, so what that's going to do is it's going to create the role, but only if it doesn't already exist, which means we can run this code more than once and it's okay. Now let's go back over here to our users table. Let's look at our data, and we have the user ID and we have the user name, which is also the email address. So I think what we're going to need to do is we're going to ask for, let's do it this way, let's give us a little more space. I'm going to ask for identity manager after all, or is it user manager? It's user manager. So let's copy that and paste it in there, and I'll do my control dot to add the private field for that. So now that I have my roles, I'm going to check to see if I have a user, and then once I have the user, I'm going to add a role to it. So let's do this. Let's just find the user and add the role right away. So var user equals await user manager dot find. We have a few options: by email, by ID, by login, or by name. Let's do by email, which we know the email and the user ID is the same. So it's tim@imtimcorey.com. Notice we're hard coding all these things. It's not the greatest, but at the same time, it's what you do for startup. Again, this will only be created once, and we create the one user ID, and then from then on, we create through the front end. But this is kind of like our admin. You'd probably pull this stuff from the config file, but we're going to pull it from here. We're not going to keep this code in here. I'm going to comment it out. I'll give it to you. But that way, you could create this and have it be executed somewhere, on the first time you run it. Sometimes people execute this every single time, and I'm not a big fan of that, because then you're just making things slower for no reason after the first time. That's why I avoided it before. Okay, so now I'm going to say if user exists, so user question mark, if user is not equal to null. There we go. And then we're going to say is we're going to create that role. So user manager dot add to role async, and which means we need to wait this, and we're going to pass in the user, and the role is going to be the role name. So let's give this user admin rights. Okay, so this user is going to be admin, and actually I'm going to do the same thing again and make sure that they're also a cashier. Now it's not going to add it more than once, so that if you add a user to a role they're already in, it just leaves it alone. Okay? So in theory, this going to the privacy page will kick off all of these changes to our entity framework database. Let's see if now I've made all of these changes, if they're going to work. What do you think the odds are? I think they're pretty poor, but we're going to find out. So let's go to the privacy page. And we've gone to the privacy page. Okay, so let's go to SQL Server Object Explorer and go to Roles and View Data. And now there's an admin, a manager, and a cashier. Cool. And if we go to ASP.NET User Roles and go to View Data, there's now 2 links here, both for the same user ID, but for different role IDs. That means that, in theory, our user has been added to the correct 2 roles. So it looks like it worked. Now let's go back to that same page. So let's go back to the privacy policy. Let's go back to Home. Let's go to privacy policy again. Went a little faster this time. Okay. I did it a couple more times. Now let's go back here and go to user roles. And there's still only 2. That's good. And if we go back over here to roles and go to view data, there's still only the 3. So we haven't duplicated anything with this code. With that being said, I am going to comment it all out. I don't really want that running whenever you go to the privacy page. But it's there for you if you want to take this and put it into your own method to run whenever you first start up your application. You might even want to create a custom route that does that. And so you just navigate to /admin and it creates those things. And since it's done this way, even if someone found out that you had a /admin and ran it, it wouldn't break anything. All right? So now that we've got that running, in theory, our API is the same as the other API we already had. And we've made a modification to the WPF project to point to the correct API. So let's go to our solution and we'll set up the multiple startup projects. Okay? So set up multiple startup projects. Right now, the TRM data manager is supposed to start. We're going to say none to that, but we are going to start the TRM API. So the API and then the desktop UI. And now we're going to hit start on this. And this should launch both. So there's our API starting to launch. And we have our WPF project, which has the same username and password. I made them the same so that it should still work. Let's hit login and see what happens. Not found. Okay, now let's look over here at this. It looks like it did make a call here, but let's do it again. Notice it's making a change. Notice down here it's actually changing things. And it's saying that it's trying to make a call, but we're getting a not found error. So something's not quite right. All right, so let's look at the Kestrel, and it says that we're making a call to localhost 5001 on HTTPS/token. And we're form URL encoding our call, and we're getting a 404, which is not found, meaning it can't find that endpoint. Okay, so we're missing the endpoint somewhere. We're not quite sure why. Let's come up here and look to see if we can do /token, which is going to say not found because that's the get call for it. But it looks like that's our problem, is we're not finding the token endpoint. Okay, so let's stop that. So I think what we're going to do right now is we're going to stop the video here, even though we're halfway done, because now we've kind of run into a little bit of a wall in that we don't even have /token. And so we're going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit with authentication inside of .NET Core and how it's different, and how we're going to have to make some changes, or how we're going to have to change our API in order to match up with the way we were doing things. Okay, so either change our API or change what's calling our API, and we're going to weigh the pros and cons and figure out how to get this all up and running and going. Okay, so it's going to be a separate video on its own. So I'm going to break it off here, and we're going to go on to that next video shortly. Okay, so for now, what we're going to do is we're going to commit our changes, because these changes are they're not complete, but at the same time, we have made a lot of changes, and I don't want to not commit these. I'm going to commit all of these, which is actually a whole new project as well as some other changes. So let's added new API and moved over functionality. Okay, so I'm going to commit that and push it up to the server, even though it's not fully working. So if you were on the master branch here, which I am, but if you were on a team, you wouldn't push this to master. You'd push it to a private branch or a branch that maybe others have access to, but it's not the main branch. Otherwise, right now you've broken the build and no one can use your development server. Okay, so you wouldn't do that if you were in a team, but on your own, it can be okay. All right, you can always roll back that commit now. But now we have that in place. What we'll do is we'll start working on our authentication and authorization system next. Okay? Until then, thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.